Well, hello everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar today. And I'm really pleased to be part of this. This is a webinar that was created and really developed at one of the presenters' recommendations. And it was Dr. Shannon Franklin who had decided that it was an important topic, and I'm so thrilled that we were able to get it on. And without further ado, I want to introduce the presenters today. And again, this is for the SDPA Committee, Anti-Racist Practice as Ethical Practice, a panel discussion on eliminating systemic racism and implicit bias in the therapy room. The first presenter is Dr. Shannon Franklin. And Dr. Franklin is a licensed psychologist specializing in college-age mental health, does a tremendous amount of work, and is a tremendous source of support and treatment to the LGBTQ community. She works with gender identity and also works with the BIPOC population. She's also worked with undergraduates and graduate students at various university counseling centers, and is the recipient of a 2019 Women of Impact Award from the University of San Diego. Wonderful accomplishment. She maintains her private practice in Hillcrest, and she also, in the private practice, she utilizes short-term and long-term treatments, personality assessment, and gender assessment, especially and and particularly in terms of support of the trans community seeking gender-affirming surgery. Finally, Dr. Franklin is the co-founder of Solve for X Mutual Aid, and this is a mutual aid organization that aims to redistribute resources, including financial support, within the community. Since starting it at the beginning of the COVID-19 epidemic, they have been able to raise $25,000, which they've contributed to over 200 people in the community. So incredible accomplishment. And moving on to the second presenter. Dr. Johnson is a native of California and born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area, where she attended, and she also attended the Azusa Pacific University. She has a PsyD in clinical psychology with an emphasis in forensics. She has a passion for diversity, minority populations, and issues around relationships and trauma. And she completed her dissertation evaluating the impact of micro and macro systemic factors on marriage in the United States. And she continues to study the impact of systems on marriages and lives. And in her private practice, she provides evaluations for the Department of Social and Health Services. And I am Dr. Justin Apolitical. I am facilitating and hosting today. So I will be monitoring questions provided by the attendees and providing those questions as they come up to continue to facilitate the dialogue between the presenters. The way that the presentation is going to be conducted is a fairly loose conversation between Dr. Franklin and Dr. Johnson. They will be going over issues and questions that were generated regarding this very important issue, and kind of uncovering the ethical challenging ethical considerations that are involved in treating and working with various populations with the context of racism and implicit bias in the therapy room. My experience is I'm a qualified medical evaluator, forensic and clinical psychologist here in San Diego. I work specifically with patients dealing with trauma and depression, and most of my work is in the areas of workers' compensation and personal injury when it comes to forensic. I also have an interest and passion for failure to launch issues in young adults, so helping young adults move through the transition into adulthood and independence in my life, or in their life. And without further ado, let's go ahead and start the presentation. And I will, as I say, we'll be going until 11:45 for the kind of formal webinar. But as I say, Q&A will be continuing, and then at around 11:45, I'll let everyone know that we're coming closer to 12, and we'll open it up to a more, I guess we'd say, comprehensive and thorough Q&A to see if there's if we can get more questions and answers at that time. We may also extend today and go beyond 12 depending on the need, and we'll make that determination toward the end of the presentation. So with that, I will hand it over to the presenters. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Justin. And for folks who have questions throughout, go ahead and throw it in the question and answer space, and Justin will be moderating that. I'm so excited to be here. Hello, Dr. Johnson.
Hello, Dr. Franklin.
So like Justin said, this is going to be a casual conversation between Nikki and I. And, you know, I think it's a good time to have this conversation. And so I guess we can just get started.
Sure. I think I just wanted to be mindful of how many people we have logged in here. We have 130 people and that number is growing. And I just really appreciate people taking the time to join us for this. In this current political climate and the world we're living in, they're taking time out of your day to proactively seek this, I think is huge. So yeah, let's begin.
So the first question is it necessary to be politicized in order to engage in anti-racism work? And if so, how do you integrate that into therapy? And I know Nikki and I kind of talked about starting with some definitions and some disclaimers. So Nikki, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, something I wanted to mention is I think the world of social justice right now moves really fast. The terms are changing, the trends change. Things that were a new idea a year ago are almost accepted as commonplace a year later. And it happens so fast that it can feel like even for Dr. Franklin and I who are immersed in this work, we're often catching our breath just to keep up. There's always new books and new authors and big movements. And so it's very exciting. It also can be really intimidating. It can feel like, you know, oh, I left this dialogue for 1 year and I came back and it had already evolved so much. And I think there's a lot of fear that what we say might not be PC or we might offend someone, and that therefore it prevents us from engaging in that. And I just want to acknowledge out loud that that is a very real fear. And we believe that the more you engage, the more you explore your own biases and thoughts, the more you understand where you lie in your position, the more comfortable you're going to be with these conversations. We are going to be operating from a few assumptions. I think the assumption is, well, one, that implicit bias exists, that privilege exists, that systemic racism exists. And those are kind of the three things that we really need to acknowledge as we're getting into this work and some of our answers. And if you have questions about those things, you can kind of throw them over to the Q&A area, but we are going to operate from those assumptions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another thing that we're operating from is what racism means and what anti-racism means. And so Nikki and I are going to be using Ibram Kendi's definition of racism and anti-racism. So he understands racism as one, or someone who is racist, as one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions of expressing a racist idea. And then any sort of racist policy is a measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. So what we're looking at is not if one group is treated differently, but is there an inequity because of this difference? So therefore, something that's anti-racist is something that is trying to make things more equitable, right? So any policy or any measure that produces or sustains equity between racial groups. So the idea of racism is a powerful collection of both policies and lived experiences that create this inequality and continue racial racist ideas. And so any sort of active policy or ideas that create this equity is going to be anti-racism. But the most important part is what we're doing creating equity or inequity? And also the fact that the opposite of racism isn't neutrality or not racist. It has to be something active, which is anti-racism. So we're working from that lens when we talk about anti-racism in the workplace and in the therapy room.
And the idea that anti-racist work is proactive, that neutrality historically stands with the side of oppression, right? So we have to be proactive in our work. We have to be calling it out. I think I was reading over some writings by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from 1968, and he writes to social scientists, who are us, and he writes that the majority are unprepared and unwilling to accept radical structural change. In resisting and producing chaos while complaining that if there was no chaos, orderly change would come. So saying, we're often telling people, just wait a little longer, just wait a little longer, just wait a little longer. And I think we're in a tipping point culturally where people say, no more waiting, we're moving. And that's infiltrating all kinds of different fields. I don't know if infiltrating is the right word. That sounds so aggressive, but it's moving into many fields, psychology included.
Absolutely. So the question of, is it necessary to be politicized? My reaction is yes, absolutely. But what does politicized mean? To me, being politicized is not necessarily liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, but rather, are you aware of the political state of what's happening in the moment? Are you aware of the policies that are impacting our clients on the daily? And are you able to discuss how these policies impact our clients' emotional life? So if you're in San Diego, you better know about DACA policies. You better know about immigration policies because it will impact both your folks of color and non-folks of color that you work with. And so being able to talk about those things with that knowledge, I think is absolutely essential.
Yeah. I would say I agree. It's not necessarily a party, but more just the understanding of the systems and policies, because systems and policies impact people. And people is generally our passion, right? So understanding what are the things that impact them. So I totally agree with what a lot of Dr. Franklin is saying. You've got to know your demographic, and you've got to be proactive in educating yourself about the things that they're encountering, so they're not spending that precious therapy time educating you, telling you about what's going on. Instead, going, this is my client's experience, and I need to go learn some of that on my own. And I think that involves education. There's been some really interesting research that shows just 2 hours a week of staying on top of your clinical skills and your treatment knowledge and your research, just 2 hours a week dramatically improves clinical outcomes. So when they're looking at people who are having the best effect from therapy and the therapists that are most on the game, they're people who are putting in just a little bit of that time outside of counseling to hone their skills and hone their knowledge. And I think another part of being politicized or empowering in anti-racist work is knowing things like, what's the current vernacular? What is this population saying? Because I think word choice communicates whether you know about an issue. And the wrong word choice communicates to your client that you don't know very much about this issue, and they may not feel as safe with you. So taking the time to say, what are the terms that are being used right now, is a subtle but effective way of saying, I value you.
Absolutely. And so if we're okay with being politicized, being aware of the politics, engaging it, the next question is like, how do we integrate it, right? And so I just want to start by showing my background. This is one way that I integrate being politicized, of showing up with a non-neutral stance. And I know therapists have been really taught to be as neutral as possible. But the tricky part is that being a therapist is not neutral because it's grounded in historic oppression, right? The fact that being gay was in the DSM as a diagnosis, right? The fact that it was made by white cis straight men for histrionic women. These are things that show up in the room before you even open your mouth, right? And so I'm thinking about Kenny's idea of being anti-racist or being active in that. How do I create a space without having to say anything that says I'm welcoming, I'm open, right? And it depends on what setting you're in, right? So maybe if you're in a prison, this might not be the best setting. But showing up with that, I have my pride flag, my trans pride, I have a Black woman, shows that I'm here to understand you and I'm open to things. And so I think that's absolutely essential alongside of the language that you use, right? And I think from some therapists struggling with what is neutral and how can I be mindful of not swaying my client or making all my clients comfortable is important. But I also want to hold neutrality as something that is actively racist because it's not anti-racist, right? And so how do we work through the privilege of being apolitical, right? And engage that in our work.
I think you said something so good. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean about the privilege of being apolitical?
Absolutely. So for a lot of folks, especially folks who are minorities, like you and I, Nikki, our body, our livelihood, our personhood is politicized. So for example, over the summer, where the BLM movement, as a Black woman, like I could not breathe without thinking about that. It was impossible for me to do that, right? As a queer woman, when new policies come up about whether or not discrimination can happen, it's impossible for me not to think about that, right? And so if those things are not on your mind every day, you don't maybe need to look at it so much, is a privilege because you get to engage in the world where who you are is seen as the norm, right? And so some folks being white, being cis, being straight, being male, being able-bodied, having thin privilege, all are cloaks that makes it seem like we don't have to look at things, but they're all right there whether we want to look at them or not.
Yeah. No, absolutely. At the risk of sharing too much about our personal lives, I know, like, I'm biracial. My husband's biracial, and he's half Black, half white. And we had our first child during COVID. And as all of this stuff was going on with these protests, we were just looking at him and going, oh my gosh, what kind of world is he going to be raised in? What are people going to assume about him? What are people going to think? What does his name convey? Is his name... And this was actually part of our conversation. Do we name him something that is clearly an ethnic sounding name? And if we do that, will that potentially be a barrier when he's applying for things? And it's all subtle, but it's all significant, right? And infiltrates kind of our daily lives and our thinking.
Absolutely. And if you and your husband were both white folks, you might not need to think about how will my kid's name impact their ability to get a job as much as you do now.
Yes, absolutely.
I think another way that I integrate being politicized into the therapy room in particular is the way that I use my case conceptualization. And for me, it's really, I take a feminist approach, so it's important for me to be open with my clients about how I'm conceptualizing with them, and also from a dynamic approach. And so thinking about a system, right? One part of the system that they're in is this America as a system. It's the historical context of being present. And so thinking about how does capitalism being colonized impact the way that we think about ourselves, right? The way that we put values into things. And so I think expressing that as part of your conceptualization with a client is going to be essential to say, I see that a lot of your value comes from production, and perhaps this is from the colonization that's happened over years and years, or perhaps this is from capitalism. And what do we do with that? Do we want that value to stay true? And maybe you do, and that's okay, but let's just see how the system is impacting you as a client. And Nikki, I know you do a lot of diversity teachings and you talk about systems a lot. Do you want to share a little bit of light on that?
Oh my gosh. gosh, I don't want to go into rabbit holes and weeds, which I can do because I do teach. I'm a professor, which means the Lord knows I can talk. But I think it's really interesting how much systems impact us, and we forget. Like I mentioned, like was mentioned before, my dissertation was about how marriages are impacted by all these systems around us, from the economics of what are going on. Are there wars going on? Is there shortage of partners? What is all these things impact the individual? And I could answer any specific questions you have, but something I flesh out a lot is capitalism as a value in America, meritocracy, that you earn everything, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The idea that we have a nuclear family, what does that look like? Values of hard work and all of this aren't bad values, right? They're just lenses that we're born into and that we have been seeing and breathing our whole lives. And there's pros and cons to a lot of that. But it is also a bias that we can bring into therapy as clients, that some values are intrinsically better than others. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure we're all therapists, so we've all been through school. So we know that pressure to keep performing and to keep doing more and keep achieving and earning more and more and more and more and more. And that's a bit of American mindset. Mm-hmm. And it's a value system.
Absolutely. The next question is, how do we ethically address racial identity and empowerment without imposing our bias? I think what a good question that is. And I think someone in the chat asked about the idea of white fragility and naysayers of that. And the most important thing, I think, is know your information, because it can be so scary to bring up some information if you're not super solid on it, right? And so as psychologists, we're expected to bring in any sort of social science, right? About trauma, about anxiety, about depression. Well, the same thing is true with racism, right? There's so many studies and stats about how these things impact one another, right? And so if we're coming from a factual space, right, that's not something that's our opinion or our bias, right? The fact that Black folks are overdiagnosed and underserved in the mental health community. That's not my opinion. That's a fact that, statistics show us, right? And so being okay with using those in the session, I think is going to be really important. And so I actually just had a session this morning when we were talking about COVID rates in El Paso and how significant that is going on right now, worse than New York, and how no one's talking about it. And we talked about racism and ableism and policy, and it was all rooted in a lot of emotional pain. I think we could have done that if I didn't set the scene to say, I trust that, those statistics are true, right? And that there is something racial happening here. You don't have to prove that to me or to believe you, because it's the reality. And so can we move into the emotional part of it?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that. I actually just talked to one of my students who's on internship in El Paso yesterday, and we've talked a lot about that and her experience as a DACA student and what that looks like. Mm-hmm. And so to kind of answer your question, I think know your information is huge. I know even here at the university I work on, when all of the activities are going on with the protests and the murder of George Floyd, we as a faculty came together and said, should we maybe bring this into the classroom? We should talk about this with our students. And what I noticed is faculty that are really engaged in this work said, yes, let's go for it. I read all these books, all these things, let's talk. And people who hadn't been engaged said, oh, I don't feel like I know enough to lead a discussion on it. And so I absolutely understand that fear. And especially because it's such a hot topic, but I think it speaks to Dr. Franklin's point of we've got to get in there, we've got to do the hard work. And I think some of the research, for example, some of the research shows that minorities already underutilize therapy services. We already know that. And of those that finally are brave enough to attend, 50% will drop out after a single session. That's really concerning. So, and then what are they likely to go back and tell their friends and family about how effective therapy was? And for those who choose to stay beyond that session, so we already have a small pool cut in half after their first session. Of the people who stay, 50% will report that they hear a microaggression from their therapist at some duration during their therapy. And again, it creates another barrier for care and another way that people don't feel heard. And so I think that is our role. That's not our client's job. That's our job, to know our information and know our own biases. Know where they lay. We have biases because we're people. And so we're going to have them. And so instead of burying our head in the sand and pretending they don't exist, we need to actively solicit feedback from our clients, because there's a power differential. We've got to say, is there anything I've done today that may have rubbed you the wrong way, that may have, come across, anything I can do better? And actually ask, because clients won't necessarily tell us. They'll just drop out and then we'll make an excuse and we'll move on to the next client. But actually seeking that information and research. And I know I talk a lot about research, I can't help it. But the research shows that if you can have a rupture and a repair, right, that the therapeutic alliance is much stronger than if you never had a rupture at all. So lean into it. Let there be that tension, sit with it, and then move forward.
Yeah, and I'll share a personal story. I see in the comments that everyone's telling us to slow down. We love to chit chat, so we'll try to be a little bit slower when we're talking.
Sorry.
One example of knowing your bias was a while ago. I was working with a couple pre-COVID, and they were struggling with connecting intentionally. They'd be on their phones on the couch next to each other, but not really engaging with each other. And so we were trying to brainstorm, what are some activities y'all can do together? And it was a Latin couple. And I said, what about like a salsa dancing lesson? And then I immediately said, wait a minute, that was a microaggression. I apologize. Let me not say that you should go dancing because you're Latin. And they kind of laughed about it. They're like, oh, Shannon, like we had a good rapport. They're like, we appreciate you saying that and seeing that. And then we kind of just like continue to talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think what that does, and my hope, is that it is modeling the fact that everybody gets stuff wrong, and I am humble and open enough to call myself out in the moment when it's happening, and process it and work through it, just like other people, hopefully my clients, can do with any kind of stuff they're struggling with in their personal life. How do they call themselves on what they're working through? Mm-hmm. This comes up a lot with folks that I work with who identify as trans, around like gender stuff. So I will often call myself out of like, oh, I just assumed your pronouns. I'm trying to do this thing where I'm working on breaking that cycle from my mind. And so I just want to apologize. Mm-hmm. And then we'll kind of process, or asking people who are not a minority group, like, how do you tell me about your experience of being white? What's that like, right? And that might be a new thing that they've never talked about, but then being open to processing that, right? And you might hear like, I don't know, it's like fine, right? And say, oh, okay, well, do some psychoeducation about, what race is and how it impacts us, and how do we, how does it connect to why you're in therapy? Right? Because just like your gender impacts us, just like, your age impacts you, your race also impacts you. And so let's both keep an eye out for how whiteness impacts your everyday functioning and the way that you see the world. Because I would hate to collude with you and act like that is the norm or the neutral, because that's not the case.
Yeah. No, I love that. As you were talking, I was thinking of, yes, like what are some examples from real life? Because I think sometimes this can be theoretical, but what does this actually look like in practice? And so love some of your like very clinical examples. What was coming to mind for me is, because I work in academia, I'm aware of, one, that there can be bias towards intelligence based on age, race, so on and so forth. So something I started doing was covering the names of my students when I'm grading their papers. Mm-hmm. So I can be neutral in my stance, not playing favorites, nor am I swayed by knowing previous information. Let's block out the names and I'll grade them independently. And then I look at whose paper it was afterwards. Mm-hmm. So that I can make sure I'm not being biased in the way I'm grading. Being mindful in the classroom of how different cultures may present, being sensitive to that. And in my own clinical work, I think about a time where recently I was doing assessments and I had a few stacked up back to back. And I ended up having a male and a female who are similar age, same race, both presenting with very, very similar symptoms. And after they'd left, I'm writing up their assessments and I have to give my diagnoses. And I started, and so my first instinct was to go borderline for her, antisocial for him.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I was writing it, because I'm trying to be aware of how I diagnose, I took a moment to step back and go, wait a minute. Why is hers borderline and why is his antisocial when their behavior is actually very similar? Mm-hmm. If I'm not looking for that, if I'm not trying to be proactive, I would just let it fly. And if anybody questioned it, I would defend it. And instead going, okay, wait, hold on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think I have a gender bias that's seeing their diagnosis differently. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same lens that we see a lot of behavior through, whether it's socioeconomic or whatever. We have to really, really be mindful of catching our own biases. And a great way for me that I've noticed is when I'm really upset, what's the mean thing I say in my head?
Mm-hmm.
What is that mean thing my mind goes to? And I go, there it is. Mm-hmm. And trying to catch it and going, okay, where did that come from? That was an automatic thought. Where is that rooted? And exploring that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love when you said automatic thoughts, because I think that's so connected to what we're talking about. And I know a question that comes up later is, like, if someone says something racist in the room, do you address it or not? Mm-hmm. And I look at part of racist thoughts, not all of it, mm-hmm. as a broken system, right? And so racist thoughts are cognitive distortions, stereotypes, cognitive distortions. Mm-hmm. If it was any other cognitive distortion, of course we would call our clients out to that. Of like, I hear you're minimizing or catastrophizing or doing future telling, right? And so if I have a client who is sharing something that way, I might use that to address a stereotype that comes up or a racist thought. Mm-hmm. Also might use their own values in a strength-based approach. I hear you say, you're worried about your daughter dating this person of color, but I also know that one of your values is love and compassion. Let's see how both of those things are impacting each other, right? Let's explore that together. Or like, we've been working on not jumping to conclusions, and I wonder if this is coming up right now. What does that mean? Let's look at it together. So coming from a way that, just like you address any other cognitive distortion, will maybe diffuse it, not make it feel so heated, and reduce defensiveness.
Mm-hmm. Sure. That also makes me think of, if people remember, like the Sue and Sue text, the different racial identity development models, mm-hmm. right? We've got Helms for white racial identity development. We've got Cross for Black racial identity development. We've got Hardiman and Sue, who kind of have just a more general culture development model. And how much we bring it into the room is often what the client is bringing to us in the context. You might, in a racial identity development model, someone in an earlier stage may deny that that there is any difference between people at all. And that is a different client than someone who's maybe in stage 3 of Cross's model, where they're angry at a system and they've been hurt and they've seen things. And guess what, therapists, like, we often represent the system. Mm-hmm. As much as you love your client individually, you have to be very aware that sometimes you look like the oppressor. You look like the problem. You look like the man. You work for an institution, you give diagnoses, you work for a center, and there's a power differential. And therapists are, I think it's about 86% are white or Caucasian. And so it's a very small percentage that are minority, and even minority therapists could be seen as representing a systemic oppression. So absolutely. Creating a space where you could try to level that field a little bit and be able to take some heat from your client, because they may have anger that's directed towards a system and you look like that system. Mm-hmm. And that's an okay place to be, and not running away from your client's anger, but being able to actively explore it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you look like the system, back to how do you not look like the system? And maybe like a pride flag is one way that you not look like the system. And not just you look like the system, like you are the system. I am the system, or you are the system, because we are in it. And any moments that we're not doing anti-racist work is doing racist work, right? And so there was a quote that I heard at a training from a Black woman. I forget her name, but she said that since we were born, it's been raining anti-Blackness, so of course we're all drenched. And I love that quote, this idea that, yeah, we're in the system, we're all a part of the system, and so let's not act like we're not drenched in this, but let's use this to make some change and do something different. Another kind of question was, if a client does not bring up racial issues, should we bring them up? I think we've been talking a little bit about that, and we also have some questions in the Q&A. Justin, if you want to pop in at all, we can definitely talk about that.
Should we bring up racial issues? I would say during the intake, it's critical. You've got to mention it at least in session 1 or 2, because it's part of that biopsychosocial spiritual model that we're always talking about. It's about looking at our client in 3D. And I think because, we've taken multicultural classes or so on and so forth, I saw a quote and it said, statistics tell you a lot of information about a group, but very little information about the individual sitting in front of you. And so I really love that, because it says, like, some of these broad things may be true, but maybe some of it's not for your client. And so allowing an opportunity to explore race and all the facets of their identity, communicate, 1, I see you as a unique individual, and 2, that these topics of conversation are on the table. We're allowed to talk about them here. And even for our white clients who might say, I don't think about race, I don't know, it doesn't impact me. Setting the stage for saying, well, if that's something we want to unpack, we can do that here. Or if you're having a reaction to the political world and you feel like you're being blamed, and you feel like you're being attacked, but you don't feel like you have a safe place to talk about that because you're worried about saying the wrong thing. And we do know that due to stereotype threat, that white individuals will often not engage in conversations where they could be perceived as racist. Maybe that's something you can bring into the therapy room and unpack together. So I think it's an important thing to bring up, even if it is not the main focus of all your sessions, depending on what your client brings. It's an important component. And the last thing I will say is we tend to avoid politics, race, and religion, I think, in our therapy. A lot of us, myself included, would rather hear someone's worst childhood trauma narrative. Like, I'm more comfortable hearing that than I am approaching some of these sensitive areas. But if they're sensitive, it might mean that our clients are deeply impacted by them. And many of them say they wish their therapist brought it up more. But I think it's a way where, as therapists, we avoid the very areas we're uncomfortable with.
And that's why education and training grad programs, internship programs are so essential, so that upcoming therapists feel comfortable talking about those things. Absolutely. And I want to add to the intake, because I think checking in with white clients in particular about their race is essential. And you might hear the whole, like, I'm white, that's it. Or they might talk about ethnic groups, which I think is really important, gives us lots of good context around values, maybe immigration history. But I do think it's important to say, I hear you talk a lot about, your Italian heritage or, your English heritage. I'm also curious, race and ethnicity are different, psychoeducation. I'm really curious about your whiteness and how that impacts you. And if they say, I never really thought about that before, this being like, okay, that's something for us to continue. Because that's a little seed, right? We don't have to dig into it. You don't have to go on a pedestal, but like, I'll come back later in the session. And then I also think it's fantastic to come back session 2, session 3 of saying, hey, was there anything in the intake that you, client, wanted to share that we maybe missed? And then I'll say, actually, there's something that I missed. I didn't ask you about your ethnic identity. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about that. Being able to come back to it. I think another thing when working with people of color is being able to verbalize that things happening in their life that always have a racial context. And in the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, Olu talks about the idea that is something racist or not depends on whether or not the person who's the minority thinks it is, right? And because the intent may not be, but the impact will be due to the historic nature of racism in this country, right? So at the university, if I have a client who's saying my professor is not treating me properly and they're a person of color, I'm going to ask them, I wonder if race is playing into this. What are your thoughts about that, right? And if they think yes, then race is playing a part, because historically in a predominantly white institution, race does play a part, right? So whether or not it was the professor's intention in that moment doesn't really matter, but the landing experience, the emotional experience is really important. If I didn't say, I wonder if race is connected to the situation, I wonder how gender is impacting this, or I wonder how ethnicity is, then they might not feel comfortable expressing it themselves due to internalized racism, right? Which is very true and impacts all of us.
Right.
Dr. Franklin, I want to ask, I think this is a good time for a question that relates, I think, to what you're talking about. The attendee asks, they state that they would love to hear your thoughts on a client after this individual made mention of BLM and anti-racist protests occurring in the city. The white middle-class female client said something like, I'm sick of that, I'm sick of hearing that. I think the question is kind of around, what do you do when it's pretty evident that the person is maybe all the, further on the spectrum of someone who is not going to be as open to this kind of conversation and maybe aggressively against some of these ideas. How do you handle an individual who shows up that way once you've opened the door?
Yeah, great question. What I might do in that situation is to focus on the emotions, right? I'm sick of hearing that. Wow, that's a heavy emotional reaction, right? And so I might say like, it sounds like there's some feelings connected with that. What's that about, right? And hearing of like where that emotion's coming from. Maybe they feel misunderstood. Maybe they feel like their rights and needs are not being looked at, and go from that. So you're feeling a lot of pain right now. It sounds like you have a lot of in common with the people in the Black Lives Matter movement, where they're not feeling their rights and needs are being addressed. And go through that emotional connection in order to reduce defenses rather than trying to convince somebody that it's important to think about it, right? And then again, planting seeds. So, that's really emotionally impactful. Let's process that a little bit. And then later on, I imagine that might come up in a different way, right? Feeling like their wants and needs are not getting met, something else, right? And being able to connect those two. Of like how they see the world, right? It seems like perhaps this lens in which you view the world, maybe often you feel like your wants and needs are not being met. Like, let's look at that together. So how do I integrate what just happened into a conceptualization and thread it throughout the therapy work? It would be super overwhelming. In that moment, you had to defend the Black Lives Matter movement. That's too hard. But I think it is important to identify the intense emotions with it so that in the future, when other intense emotions come up around something similarly, you can continue to address it and kind of stick it in your mind.
And one other thing I would mention is, I know this wasn't directed towards me, so I apologize for inserting, but also understanding the perspective of the party you don't agree with or the position you don't agree with. I believe it's McGuire's attitude inoculation studies that show we understand our position a lot better when we understand the nuances of our counter position. And even if anyone who just recently watched that Netflix documentary about how social media tracks everything that you do.
The social dilemma.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Like social dilemma. Go in there and research some of the positions you don't agree with so you at least understand the perspective. And mess up your own algorithms so that you get exposed to content that you maybe wouldn't otherwise be exposed to or wouldn't normally pop up, mess up your algorithms, and then get an idea of what that position looks like clearly so you can address it with your client. So when I hear someone say, oh, I'm just so sick of all that BLM stuff, I could call my client a racist, A, or, which I mean, okay, but B, also go, okay, what is it about this? Is this a position of law and order that they believe? Is this a value? Do they not believe systemic injustice exists, which I think is very common? Do they believe it's un-American? What is the value that is being violated? And let's process the value and if that's true or not. And that is what I will say about that. But yes,
You know, I want to point out too. It seems, you know, I'm looking at some of the questions. I think we have one question, and if the client is offended when you say that the client has feelings a lot like those demonstrating, you know, somebody else says that they're interested in thoughts about someone from the Philippines. These are separate questions, and perhaps could be answered separately, but also, you know, kind of collectively, it seems that the attendees are wondering, you know, this is kind of the what happens when it doesn't go well, right? When you have the dialogue and all of a sudden you're realizing this client is really unhappy, right? Or this client does not agree. What is the ethical responsibility or the ethical position there? Is it the ethical obligation to try to persuade or educate them on this? Or do we stand down and allow them to have this worldview? And I think that's a question that seems to be coming up for people in different forms.
Mm-hmm. My gut reaction to that is that your client shouldn't always like you. And that might be a little bit risque, but I'll tell my clients things that they're hard to hear. And I might say something like, all right, you ready? I'm going to say something that you're probably not going to like. And then we're like, okay, Shannon, yeah, okay, tell me what it is, right? But it's making that rapport of, I love you so much that I will challenge you, right? And this is a space that we do hard work. This is not a space where, you know, you vent and then I say, poor baby. Sometimes I do that, absolutely. I have to create that connection and that validation. But there's other times where we're doing hard work, right? And so I think it's totally okay if your client's upset with you. Back to what Nikki said about that break is important if you can work through the rupture and repair it, right? And so I would say what's happening. It seems like you're really unhappy with me right now. What's going on? Right? Or like, I hear that you feel like you don't like that I said that you were activated by this. What about that feels not so hot? What about this doesn't feel good? Mm-hmm. Or I do a lot of like, oh, okay, like, yeah, you don't like that? Okay. And then like, see what they say, right? Not necessarily being like, I didn't mean this way or whatever else, but just being like, isn't that curious together? I'm not judging. This is a really curious reaction. I love being curious. What a curious reaction. Let's keep an eye on that, right? And being mindful with how much you're doing at once, because you have time, as long as that rapport is connected, to continue to, again, thread it through, right? So if my client's angry at me, I'm going to be, one, non-defensive. I get excited whenever my clients are angry at me. I'm like, perfect, now we can do some hard work. Yeah, tell me. And I get to be a model for, you can be angry at me and I will still care, love for you, and I will hold that anger for you. So yeah, you're angry, let's do this. I can hold it. I have boundaries that are healthy and safe. And so let's process this together, and you won't have to worry about me being offended or being mad and like saying something cruel, because I can be that safe space. I can be that secure attachment, if you will, to hold that. Mm-hmm. That's my gut reaction.
Yeah. Just want to point out that we're at about 10 minutes till noon, and it sounds like, you know, the Q&A is kind of part of the conversation. So what I might invite us to do is let me see if I can pull up some more questions here. And one of them two of them are addressing various minority groups. One individual asks about a Japanese immigrant and this idea that racism that is experienced from this particular group, which is the Kashete Japanese, is qualitatively and quantitatively different and much less from, they say, and much less from more marginalized folks. And then we also have an individual who states that I'm interested in your thoughts about someone from the Philippines who complain that they are sick of BLM and that all lives matter. Can you both address, the differences in kind of addressing these issues and talking about racial identity and racial issues with various minority groups? And is there a difference in the way that you approach it from one minority group to another?
Sure. Real quick, can I ask a follow-up on the Japanese client? What specifically was the question around it?
I guess the question is, the individual says, the racism I experience is qualitatively and quantitatively different from more and much less than other marginalized folks. So I think what they're saying is their experience of racism might not be as, it seems that it's potentially less from their experience than other marginalized groups.
Okay.
There's no question, and I just wonder if they're maybe saying, well, this might not ring as true to me because I'm not, each group has potentially their own experience of racism, and what do you do with someone who maybe is a minority group who doesn't identify themselves as maybe as marginalized as others? That's what I'm taking from it. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So my first instinct is we don't want to assume that because someone is a person of color that they believe a certain thing. Right. So even in the recent elections, we saw the Latino voters were very split. We see Asian voters as fairly split for various reasons. We saw Venezuelans much more conservative due to a fear of what socialism will look like. You might have a lot of political climate things from countries of origin that impact beliefs and viewpoints and that kind of thing. And not everybody experiences everything the same way. That's part of understanding our clients as individuals. I think the two groups you mentioned are both Asian, and so there's a model minority kind of idea that gets placed on them, which is something we could flesh out. But I would also say that just because we have not experienced something does not mean that other people in the group are not experiencing that thing. I think of, or that we're still not impacted by it. So I think of Black individuals when asked, have you been harassed by police? Well, about a little under 40% would say no. And so you can absolutely find Black individuals who say, I have not encountered any kind of police brutality, but that doesn't make up for the qualitative data, well, the quantitative of the 60-ish% plus, or the qualitative data of the lived experience of other people. So understanding that each person is unique and one lived experience does not represent the whole group, nor should we assume a whole group takes a certain position.
Dr. Johnson, I want to point out to the individual who asked that question had pointed out that that there was an original or a question that was provided earlier. So I want to add that because I think it'll create some context. The individual states, I struggle with tone policing. He explains, Brene Brown says BIPOC cannot shame others when we advocate. Robin DeAngelo says BIPOC can give feedback in whatever way, and white people need to appreciate the feedback. When we speak up, it is a trauma response. We cannot engage the prefrontal cortex when we speak up. I have been tone policed a lot. I am struggling to advocate and point out microaggression in a way that white people are okay with. And I feel Brene Brown is tone policing. What do you think?
Tone policing is such a great point. I love that. Nikki, do you mind if I jump in?
Oh, this had your name on it.
Yes. Okay, great. So I'm not the huge fan of Brene Brown, so I won't talk about that part. But however, I will say that you're right. When minority folks are speaking, this is their rights, their livelihood, their personhood. It's personal, it's emotional. And so we can't necessarily always control or should have to control the way that we say it, right? And I think it is on the responsibility of white people to hold whatever is coming their way, right? And so something that's sticking out is if a person of color, calls you in, calls you out for saying something, or says something in a way that you don't like, it feels too aggressive, it feels too mean, that shouldn't stop your want to help human rights, right? And so if the way someone's talking about something is not the way that you're liking it, that your reaction to it is small compared to human rights, right? So even if a person of color is, mean to you, doesn't mean that you don't want them to have rights, right? Is kind of what I'm getting at, right? And so as therapists, say we have a client, who's a person of color who, snapped back at their professor or snapped back at their boss or whatever, like said something, maybe we would deem as sassy, which is a microaggression, right, to their person. You might in your head think, well, if they answered their question differently, maybe they wouldn't be in this situation, right? And that's a perfect place to be like, oops, that's a bias, right? That folks have to speak in a certain type of way to earn their rights, right? Because if something racist is happening, it shouldn't be happening, right? And so no matter how they address it later on, that's not the problem. The problem is that the racist thing happened in the first place, right? And so I think that's a great way to check yourself. I don't like how this person's telling me, oh, what a privilege it is that I get to choose how I receive this information, where the person of color has no choice over whether or not their rights are being impacted on the daily, right? And so noticing that little flare up and saying, this is a fantastic opportunity for me to change my biases and rewiring, right? We're rewiring our neural passageways, just like with, automatic thoughts of, oh, I'm going to take this as a fantastic opportunity to learn something new, to notice what's happening in my body. I'm feeling kind of activated by it and say, this is white supremacy coming up in my body. Isn't that odd? Okay, well, let me do something different, right? So the thing isn't, for example, when people were looting, right? Looting, to me, I don't care about looting because someone's murdered, right? So we can talk about looting, but it's not the looting that's the issue, right? The fact is that we should be more upset that somebody was murdered than people are looting, right? And so I don't think that white folks have the space to judge the way that a reaction's happening when the reaction, any sort of reaction is valid because of racism, because of white supremacy. And so being open to noticing what that internal gauge is.
It reminds me of that quote, if somebody tells you you hurt them, you don't get to decide that you didn't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so holding space for those reactions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And we're coming up on the top of the hour, and we have quite a bit of questions left to address. I think at this point we can move towards answering the questions and letting the other attendees who want to leave know that their time has arrived, and we are at the end. But those who would like to stay to hear some more dialogue from Dr. Johnston and Dr. Franklin with the questions that are still on the table, please do feel free to stay and answer those. What do you think? Do you two feel that we should continue and press forward and answer some more questions?
Thank you for everyone if you have to head out, but we're happy to stay and answer more questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Great. Well, let's go ahead then, and we'll continue. I'm going to try to pull some now that were, for particular groups that we didn't really address. This one I thought was important. What about therapists that work with teens? I have a lot of teens that identify with social justice causes, and I feel that having my pride flag in the background creates safety for the patient. But I'm worried that the parents will not want me to work with their child if I am anti-racist or anti-oppression. And one more thing too. Well, no, let's do that. The other question is a little bit different. So why don't we start with that?
What a good question.
Great question.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like power and privilege, right? And if the parents have the power to take their client out of that space. And I'm thinking about also like where you're located, right? Located in a school versus located in a private practice situation. Mm-hmm. I have a client that comes to mind, and they were a non-binary person. And they were telling me about their first experience with therapy, and that their parents, who were very conservative, brought them to this therapist who they thought were going to do conversion therapy on them to make them not gay. But surprise, the therapist was pro-gay and a lovely human being. And so I'm thinking about how like that, if they did have a pride flag in their office, that might have been a barrier. But I'm also thinking about like the risks of that, right? Because that same therapist also, my client told me, had a whole bunch of crosses on their walls. And even though they were kind when it comes to their LGBTQ identity, there's lots of things where they never felt comfortable telling that therapist. So I think it's important to be focused on the client, which I guess, but I also think that there might be some like buy-in concerns, right, is what I'm hearing. And I think maybe there's other more subtle ways to express that maybe even like folks who are not in the circle might understand, right? And so it may not be a pride flag, but it might be a sticker of a rainbow on something, right? Or like your coffee mug might have like a little something on it that might be more in group as more nuanced way of showing that connection. So that's kind of my reaction.
Yeah. I think you hit on a really interesting point about there being a big generational divide. Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of conversations with people, especially teens that are, or young adults that are clashing with their parents over these kinds of things. And so there's a book called It's Time to Talk and Listen. It won a couple of awards. That's basically all about how to dialogue about race. And one of the suggestions is finding common values between maybe the teens and the parents, right? So the pride flag isn't the issue. The pride flag almost feels like a symptom of the issue. What are the common values that they hold? I think both parent and teen want to get along better. Probably, I don't know what their referral question is, but they want to move towards more optimal functioning. And so that can be a piece of it, but hopefully you can find values beyond just the pride flag that both can have buy-in to the conversation with. But it's also a really great book I'd recommend if anybody is interested. It's Time to Talk and Listen.
Great. With that, I want to see if we can address another younger kind of a question from someone who's addressing the position of a younger person dealing with this. And they state that I am a student and I am concerned about coming across as a white savior when addressing these issues. Mm-hmm. With individuals of color, and I would be interested in your thoughts on how to avoid this. So really, I think, this is a great question because it does address essentially, in a way, the difference between being potentially a white therapist versus a non-white therapist in dealing with this. And is there a difference in that approach? And are there other, risks or challenges to be aware of if you are white in addressing this with a person who is not white?
The word that comes to mind is performative allyship. I was thinking about what makes someone a white savior versus a white ally or a white accomplice, as we like to say now. And I think is it performative or not, right? Is the care there? Is it something I'm supposed to say, or is it something that I actually really care about? And so I'm thinking about that. And then also deepening the connection between, like, okay, so you have a client who's dealing with some racism, say at work or whatever, right? If your go-to is like, let's think about self-care and how that could, benefit you in this moment. Yes, that's important, but that kind of skirts away from the fact that something is really hurtful and broken, right? And so being able to sit with that pain, I think, is important. White guilt is so strong, and not letting that guilt move you away from sitting in that pain and hearing the injustice that happened, and validating that, right? So I think a lot of the job of a therapist is to be a witness of someone's pain, right? And so the savior part to me is like, what are you trying to do to save them? And maybe just sitting with them in it is the most important part. So like I said earlier with my client who was talking about El Paso, we didn't talk about things they could do to help their family. We didn't talk about what active measures you should call your mayor, right? No, we just sat in that pain together, feeling so helpless and feeling so discouraged. And I witnessed their pain and held it with them so it wasn't so heavy that day. So I think that's the difference perhaps between the savior of like, how can I help? Like, how can I save you versus how can I sit with you in this? Empathy versus empathy.
Yeah. And I think if savior is above, so anything you can do as a white therapist to reduce the power dynamic in terms of, if you give a diagnosis, what do you think? Eliciting feedback, being very proactive. You may have to be more proactive. Some research shows that you may have to do a little more self-disclosure than your average therapist to get more buy-in, to get more of the trust and show your humanity. So more disclosure, more proactive feedback, and then also being very open to integrating things that are helpful for that population. Does this group want to have a shaman? Is this person super close with their family? If so, instead of prescribing, saying, well, what does your family think about this issue? What is their perspective? How has it impacted your social functioning, or things that are valuable to them, in a way that you're honoring, what we know as therapists and as clinicians, but also being able to openly integrate what the clients are bringing as well.
And it's not until that question of, do you think this is connected to race? Often you'll be able to get to that pain. And I think that speaks to doing a little bit more like self-disclosure, because if that's happening in your head, you might want to say that out loud. He said.
I had a friend who worked with Native populations and said, if I told people off this reservation what kinds of things I was willing to disclose, they would have an ethical seizure. Like, I just have to disclose more to connect with this population and to show that I'm trustworthy. Sorry, Justin, if we cut you off.
No, not at all. You guys are you're hitting home runs, so I'm just going to stay quiet. Here, let's move to I think another question. This one addresses a group practice, kind of in the same area that we've been discussing. This individual states, I own a group practice and live in a predominantly white upper middle class area. All the clinicians are white. Can you recommend how we can address diversity within educating ourselves as well as reaching a greater diverse population? So I think this question is addressing, how do we address diversity with a predominantly white only environment?
My first reaction is I would take a hard look as to why all of the therapists hired there are white. So I would say that would be my first thing, and perhaps look at your hiring practices and who are you getting your referrals from? Where are you putting your ads out when you are hiring? So number one might be to hire some folks who are non-white. also using money. Money is so important, right? So hiring people of color to do diversity seminars and trainings, I think, is important. If you have, I'll share about actually my group practice that I'm part of, Hooker Psych, shout out, love you all. Owned by 2 white women who have my hearts. And when the Black Lives Matter movements was happening, when COVID was happening, they sent us an email that said, like, we want to support you, and so we're going to donate money for each of you to wherever like space you want to. And when I started my mutual aid, they gave me a check that said, yes, give this to the community. And so I felt so connected to them throughout this whole process because they were always there offering what they could to give back to the community, right? So hiring and then, putting your wallet out there to support the community through mutual aids in particular, through diversity practices. And then because you're serving a population that's just mostly white doesn't mean that your clinicians need to reflect that. And also being open to maybe a sliding scale to help other folks to advertise in spaces that are non-white, I think is also going to be important so that you're a safe place for folks of color to come. Because if I go on someone's website and I see there's only white clinicians, as a person of color, I'm not going to want to do therapy there. I don't want my therapist to be there. Because it looks like it's not safe, right? And so thinking about that on your website, is there a statement about diversity on your website? Would a person of color want to work there if there's no other people of color? And what are you doing to make it safe for a person of color to apply to a job there? So those are some things to think about.
Yeah. I thought of, the first thing that popped in mind is trainings. So this sounds maybe kind of cheesy, but what if you honestly did like a book club?
Mm-hmm.
Like, all right, we're reading Right Fragility together. As a group, like we'll buy a copy for everyone and give people a really reasonable time to read it, but check in. And so you're all kind of immersing yourself in similar ideas and knowledge. But the other thing it made me think of was barriers to care. So being mindful of what insurances do you take? Are you private practice? Are you only taking private pay? That will eliminate a very large portion of your population. Are you taking insurance? What kind of insurances? Are the insurances common to your area, or are they common to certain local hiring practices? Let me give an example. I live in Seattle. A lot of private practices want to contract with whoever Microsoft and Amazon is, whatever benefits they have, whatever insurance providers they are, that's who they want to contract with, which is great, but it also means that you basically have a tech population. And that's what they're going for, right? A lot of clinicians are being strategic in the insurances they take, being mindful of what insurance their community is insured under, and then taking that. You could also do that by understanding what are some of the communities of color, or are you easily, and can they have access? Do you have a sliding scale? Where are you located? And are you open, especially in COVID, to doing teletherapy so that location becomes less of a barrier, so that people from higher, people of color can access your care remotely? Because money speaks. To take a lower payout.
Wonderful. I want to move on. There's looks like we still have a lot of participants who are here. We still have 82, so a lot of people still listening in, and it sounds like the best thing we could do is to keep the dialogue going. This question, 55% of white women voted for Trump. And a lot of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, non-men, don't trust them, right? They are protected by patriarchy. Can you mention what white therapists can do to help this? And just to add to that, this is the same individual wrote, I'm concerned about, quote, let's be united, end quote. The division is between white people divided between maintaining, those who want to maintain white supremacy versus those who want to dismantle white supremacy. So I think what this individual is saying is that this is the divide that we're really talking about. We cannot unite without accountability and healing. I think white psychologists can proactively do more work with white people who are actively oppressing us. This is a big question, obviously, and I think the attendee is really pointing out, I think, part of what we're here to address today, which is what is the ethical position in terms of the responsibility that white psychologists, let alone all psychologists, but in this case, the individual is asking about white psychologists, the ethical responsibility to address these systemic issues, in their practices. Is there an ethical responsibility to do that? And I might add too that, with the understanding that there are risks, right? I mean, there are risks to being bold. There are risks to opening yourself up, rumbling with the vulnerability of having these conversations. You certainly could have, let's say, a white client who gets upset and says, I don't like the way that this person talked to me. I felt, judged, and you may have presented it very, very politely and very kindly, very professionally. And, they let's say, write to the board and say, hey, I want to complain about this person. I felt this, that, and the other about the way that they brought these issues up. So kind of addressing, I think, that dilemma, that ethical consideration of what is the accountability, what is the responsibility, and what are the kind of the ethical, variables that you might include in that discussion.
Yeah, well, I think absolutely it's an ethical requirement. The second ethics code is competence, right? And there is a space where scientific or professional knowledge in the discipline of psychology establishes that there's an understanding of factors associated with age, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, and so it goes on, right? So there's multiple places where in the ethics code that this is written, right? And so the question, is it ethical? It's necessary. It's absolutely ethical to address. And I would say that change will happen when white folks are interested in creating the change. And because white folks have the power and the privilege. And so I would say that work with white therapists and white clients, that's more imperative to creating social change than other spaces. And I'll just leave it at that.
There's a lot of facets to the question, so I want to make sure I'm doing it justice. So whoever wrote it, if you have a clarity question, I think of it as like racism is kind of a cognitive distortion, and with different levels of severity, almost like a substance use disorder. Is this mild, moderate, or severe? Is this something, and for a lot of white women particularly, you might see them saying it's a mild thing, unless they're encountering conflict with friends, work, their kids over these issues, then it might become more of a prevalent issue. So how much it's impacting them might impact how much I'm addressing it. I would say, and I can't speak for all white women by any means. So if you said 55% voted for Trump, the reasoning behind that might vary quite a bit. I highly doubt any of them would say it's because I'm racist. I would challenge you to find anyone who said that's why I voted for Trump, because I'm racist. I think, but that's what the other side is perceiving, and that's the divide, right? And so I would say for those clients, I think it is an ethical thing to include, not in the same way as I think of HIPAA as an ethic, or limited confidentiality as an ethic. Those are very drawn in boundaries. But I would say it's something that's worth addressing because it can be impacting them and it is a cognitive distortion. But understanding or working with them to understand where that position comes from. For example, I know a lot of white women voted for Trump because they feel strongly on abortion. And they're issue voters. So for them, it had nothing to do with race. It had to do with some other political affiliation, but to the other side, all they're seeing is you're voting against me. And it feels much personal. It feels personal and it feels about race. And so it ties back to what Dr. Franklin said earlier about intent and impact.
And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't connect intersectionality with this, right? And how gender and race impact each other, how gender, race, age, all those things, sexual orientation, interact and create something totally unique and new. And so just being mindful of that as well.
And there's a chapter in White Fragility called White Women's Tears, which I think would actually be a good chapter to read if you haven't read it so far, if you haven't read it yet.
Great. There's another question here, another area that I don't think we've addressed today. This asks, what are your suggestions for how to talk with your supervisor about diversity and multicultural issues when you feel they are not addressing it enough and or they are defensive about their own racial identity development and do not see or acknowledge their own biases and privilege?
That's tough.
I would suggest going home and writing down exactly what you mean to say. There's a power differential with your supervisor, and that makes it extra hard. I also think people can't correct things that you have not articulated to them. And so I would write it out. You get your thoughts on paper, then go back and read it the next day and take away anything that you no longer believe that you said in the heat of your venting, and get your points concise and support them with examples. In my experience in a university, administration or supervisors never like feedback unless you can give them examples and proactive solutions. A good friend of mine says, never offer a complaint without a solution. So I would say, write down exactly what you've observed, support those with a few examples, and then be proactive in giving 2 or 3 specific recommendations that your supervisor can either agree with or disagree with. But as opposed to, here's a problem, you figure it out. We've already established this person doesn't have a lot of insight into this area. So why don't you be proactive in providing a solution and allow them or invite them to come on board with you, so it does not feel so adversarial.
Yeah. I just want to validate that it's so hard to have to bring things up when there's that huge power differential, just like you said, Nikki. And I'm also thinking about perhaps that you could ask questions to your supervisor, like when you bring up a case, I'm curious as to how you believe that race is impacting this client, right? Ask them for their thoughts and ideas around it, just like you would ask your supervisor, like, what do you think about this diagnosis, right? Or, because I think sometimes things go unsaid, right? And then the term goes by and we didn't talk about race and ethnicity at all. So being active when you're bringing up your clients in your case presentation to your supervisor, saying, I'm really curious about how ethnicity impacts this client. I'm really curious of your thoughts about how the system is impacting this client's functioning, and kind of create a space for your supervisor to respond. It would be beautiful if they brought it up by themselves. That would be like the best. But if that's not happening, I wonder how you could navigate the situation so that it's a part of the conversation. And then once it's part of the conversation, you might have more examples to utilize of, like, well, I've asked you about this client, I've asked you about this client, and I'm not getting the feedback that it's helpful for me. And then I really like Dr. Johnson's idea around writing it down and then feeling more comfortable coming into the conversation.
I know when I'm in a conversation that has a big power differential, I'm like, I'm going to say all these things. You know, when you're in the shower and you're washing your hair and you're like, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this. And then you get in there and then you have to say it and you're like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be offensive. Like, come on. Like, and then you leave and you kick yourself. That's why, for me anyway, I find it really helpful in those situations to write it down so I can remember the things I meant to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a question here that I think that I would love to hear personally your responses to. How do we respond to minority clients who struggle with calling out racism in a group of people? The risks are losing the friend group and or betraying one's minority group.
my hot take is that minorities don't have to call out racism because the risk is too high. So just like folks who are LGBTQ don't have to come out because the risk might be too high, right? And so I think a lot of what our work is like, yeah, let's process the feelings around it. And if you want to be able to like say something in the moment, we can process that. But what I focus on in my therapy work more is like, let's have self-compassion for the moments where you wanted to say something, but you didn't. And again, talking about minority folks, I think it's different for white folks, but folks in that racial minority, being compassionate, because it's so hard to be a minority in spaces that are not built for you. So to have the extra pressure of having to say the right thing at the right time is impossible. I've experienced microaggressions throughout my life in professional settings, in friend groups, and I haven't said anything. And it's not because I don't know how to say it or because, I'm not upset by it, but often it takes us off guard. We're stunned that this would happen in this setting. And then otherwise, it's not safe to. What's going to happen if I do say something? What I would maybe suggest is helping that person of color connect with their white friends and allies and asking them to say something. Because I think that would be one way less work for the person of color, and it would be less risk for white allies. And so if you have a white person that you feel, like the client has a white person that they feel comfortable with, venting with, asking them to do something in moments like that, I think is more appropriate. I think it's okay for folks of color not to say anything in the moment and then be compassionate towards themselves afterwards.
Yeah, and I would add on, that is why therapy is so great, because they can come in to the room with you and say, these are all the things I'm mad about, and these are all the things that happened, and blah, here it is. And you can contain it, and you can hold it, and you can process it. And I would say, just by providing that environment, it allows them to articulate and get out exactly what's in their head. And then you can empower them to do whatever they want with that information. If they do want to pull a really good friend aside and say something, they can. If they decide they want to talk to other friends and have their allies speak for them, they can. If they've decided, it's not safe for me, but I just want to be able to process it out loud here, they can. And empowering them to do whatever feels right for them in that situation, but you've given them the framework and the opportunity to flesh it out for themselves. They don't have to hold it all in. I think is a valuable experience in and of itself.
And another thing I want to add to that is keeping in context of intersectional situations. So as a Black woman, if I say something, I'm going to be perceived as aggressive, right? I'm going to be perceived as too much, right? And so keep making sure that lens is in your mind as a therapist of them saying something in that moment may not be helpful on different levels, and there may be other reasons connected to that rather than they don't feel comfortable. It's what other stereotypes will be impacted if they were to say something in that moment. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think creating that space to hold it is good enough.
Great. I want to ask this question before we finish. We're coming to the end. And Dr. Franklin, someone had mentioned interest in hearing more about your involvement in mutual aid and the support that you provide through that organization to the QT BIPOC community. And am I saying that right, Shannon?
Yeah, QT BIPOC, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And is there any way that people who are listening can get involved and help or donate? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, awesome. I love talking about Solve for X. It's my little baby. So yeah, during COVID, me and some friends were feeling really helpless, and we knew that queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color were going to be the most impacted by the pandemic. And so we started this space where we're raising money and we directly give the funds to those folks. And that's why it's a mutual aid and not a nonprofit, so that we can just directly transfer money. And so if anyone wants to donate, there's a link in here. I'll put it in again. For SFX Together is our Instagram. and we take money via Venmo, SFX Together. And so you donate $20, $20 is going to a Black trans person, right? $20 is going to undocumented Latinx queer person. And so we provide money to the community so that they can pay the rent, get their meds, have a hot meal. And we also do education through our Instagram platform about racism, about systemic change, and connect with other mutual aids in San Diego. So a follow on Instagram would be great if you want to help. A donation would be even better if you want to help. Or any sort of services that you might provide in the future would be fantastic. And if you have clients that are identifying in the QT BIPOC population, we also have lots of resources about different mutual aids, where you get money, food, legal advice, stuff like that. And so you can also refer your clients to Solve for X, and we would love to help them. And I'll put the link in the chat right now.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we are at the end, and for those of you who stuck around, thank you so much for doing so. And I just want to thank the presenters, Dr. Franklin and Dr. Johnson. What an amazing, this really exceeded my expectations in terms of the amount of information that I was able to get from it, and hopefully that, and what I see from all the comments, it seems that so many people are appreciative of, and I had said before, Shannon, when we would discuss these in the meetings, as a white male, I feel like I have so much to learn, and to be able to be part of this and to listen and to see the conversations and to listen to so many people was extremely enriching, very humbling for me. And I really appreciate, just appreciate today. I appreciate this moment today. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And Shannon, you said that you were going to put the link up. And I think that is it. Have a wonderful day, wonderful holiday ahead. And let's go ahead and stop there.
Thank you so much, you guys.
And then Nikki and I will put our contact in the chat. Thanks for asking for it, and SFX information if you want to reach out.
See here. Yes, I will put it in. I think it's somewhere in the chat. I'll put it in there again. Thank you so much, you guys, for engaging.
Bye, y'all.
Okay, bye, everyone.